Hello and welcome to Pro Tools Answers, where we discuss, demonstrate and elaborate on your Pro Tools questions put in the official Avid Pro Tools forum on Facebook. My name is Dave Phillips, audio engineer, Avid certified instructor and lecturer for Point Blank music schools in the UK. And joining me is Anders, also an Avid certified instructor at Tonkraftwerk in Austria and lecturer for Siegen University in Germany.
Hi.
The longest credentials in the world, right?
Wow.
And in Tokyo, we have Andy.
The shortest credentials in the world, apparently.
Andy is also a Avid certified instructor. Being Avid's audio curriculum manager, he is the certifier of Avid certified instructors. So significantly important there, right?
Nice recovery.
It was entirely scripted. Now, what we do is we wade in on the forum post to throw our 2 cents in, but generally there's so much noise in the group and nuance in the circumstances that the right answers aren't always highlighted, and often there isn't enough information to clearly present the answer anyway. And a part of our job as lecturers and trainers is to take complex issues, boil them down with clear explanations and demonstrations in context, and then demonstrate those, teach those to our students. And this is what we're aiming to do here today. Now, before I continue, could I ask you guys, if you like what we're doing, could you please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon if you like what we're doing so that you get notified when our new videos are released, and of course please like the video and feel free to dislike it if you don't, but bear in mind that you will see,
don't do that,
you will see Anders cry.
Yeah. Well then, do it.
So this week's question was inspired by Titan, who asks, I'm not getting any signal from my MIDI controller. I'm using Pro Tools Ultimate, good for you Titan, and when I go to set up MIDI input devices, my keyboard is checked as enabled, but there's no signal coming out. So what we're going to do today is we're going to deep dive into MIDI specifically, getting signals in. We've got a couple of ways that we can do this. Some of it with traditional MIDI DIN connections, and some of it which is USB, which we're assuming actually what Titan is using is a USB MIDI controller. But where we're going to start off is with the traditional MIDI route, because there are still a lot of us guys out there that are using traditional MIDI interfaces and keyboards that have your MIDI in and your MIDI out plugs, some with MIDI through as well. But these are connected by MIDI DIN, and they're either going to be connected to Pro Tools by a MIDI interface which has, you know, the MIDI ports on, or as a traditional audio interface that also has MIDI ports on. And these don't automatically show up in Pro Tools. They actually take a little bit of configuring to be able to get the signal in, whereas traditional USBs typically plug and play. Andy and Anders are going to talk about that a lot later on. But I just want to start off by just showing you guys how to set up MIDI properly in Audio MIDI Studio so that we can get those signals into Pro Tools. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up a program called Audio MIDI Studio on the Mac, and this is where we can see all of our available MIDI ports. And as we can see here, we've got a PreSonus Studio 1810 audio interface, and we can see a MIDI Sport 2x2, which is a MIDI interface in its own right. The 1810 has got a single MIDI in and a single MIDI out, and we can tell that because these it's represented by these 2 little arrows underneath the this little graphic here. That shows us that we've got a port in and we've got a port out. And on the 2x2, we've got 2 ports. We've got A and B, and we've got an input for A, an input for B, and an output for A and an output for B. So this means we can plug 2 devices into the MIDI Sport, but we can only plug 1 device. I mean, directly, if we're not talking about MIDI through, we're talking about 1 device directly into the 1810. Now, to be able to do that, and actually have these represented in Pro Tools, we have to create ourselves a MIDI instrument. And we can see here that I've got this Yamaha S90, which is my main studio piano. And that is just simply created, and then the plugs plugged directly into my Studio 1810. Now this will allow the Yamaha to show up specifically in Pro Tools. Let's just flick over to Pro Tools and I'll show this, and then I'll show about creating an instrument outright. So if we flick over here, we can see on our MIDI track right here that in the traditional I/O ports where you typically see your inputs for your interface and your outputs for your interface, we can see the available MIDI ports. So just clicking the input shows us that we've got, first off, these are, it says predefined, but these basically just all of the MIDI channels that we have available, coming from the things that I haven't specifically connected an instrument to, i.e. the MIDI Sport. But if we click on the Yamaha, it doesn't show up the studio, my PreSonus I/O, because I've created this instrument that is basically overriding that. And I've got that selected to transmit MIDI on channel 4, and the piano is set up to transmit MIDI data on channel 4 only. So we can click that. And then I've got this instrument routed, or this MIDI track rather, routed to expand, and that's just on expand MIDI node number 1. Now when I press the keyboard, if I can find it without looking, you can see that that's sending MIDI data into expand. Actually, if I hit record enable, because I think that's a majority of the way that majority of you guys are going to do it to start off with, you can see that there's a MIDI signal going in there, and that MIDI signal is being routed straight over to expand. Now if we flick back over to MIDI Studio, let's create a new instrument. So I'm going to wire in a Korg M1, which is the other studio that the other keyboard that I have here. I'm going to click the little plus icon, and I'm going to name that Korg M1, and set the manufacturer as Korg. The model is M1. We can leave all of the rest of this stuff for now, and I'm a little bit funny about this kind of thing, so I'll add a picture of a Korg M1 in there. You should see my iTunes library, it's incredibly tight. Same thing. So we're going to plug this Korg M1. The output of the Korg M1 is going to be plugged into the input of port A on the MIDI Sport. We don't need to do the other way around unless I want to send MIDI signals back to the Korg M1, and then I can route the inputs of the output of the M1 into Pro Tools for recording that specific device. I just don't need to right now. I just want to have that controlling my VSTs in Pro Tools, and I think that's how a majority of us are going to be doing it anyway. I've got
David,
really itchy nose.
Let me jump in just real quick.
Of course.
This may be, and I don't mean to be condescending to anybody who might be watching this, this may be the place where people fall into problems, especially younger people, because when you're dragging the output of a MIDI interface into the input of a keyboard, you're not actually making a connection. You're telling the system the physical connection you've already made. So what Dave has done prior to setting it up in the software is he took the cable from the back of the MIDI out of, what was it, port A of your MIDI Sport. So, and then that's going in. So he's made that connection already. What he's doing at this point is he's telling the system what connection he's already made. Yeah, and if you don't set that up correctly, then there's your problem right there.
Yeah, I'm not using a USB cable. This is a traditional MIDI DIN plug.
5-pin DIN, yep.
Yeah, and connected to the output, the MIDI out on the S90, and the MIDI, or on the M1 in this case, and then the input of the MIDI Sport. So it's physical cable, it's not USB. Right. Okay, so with those connected, and it's kind of like the buses in the I/O tab, isn't it? It's just making kind of software connections. So that the tags show up correctly in the software, and the software knows where to send the signal to and to get the signal from. So if we go back over to Pro Tools now and we click on the I/O tab here, we can now see that the M1 is represented, and I have my M1 set up on channel 1. So if I select that and the keyboard was here and I could press keys on the keyboard, this track will now be looking for signals coming from the M1 plugged into port A of the MIDI Sport, and it'll be looking specifically on channel 1. If you're not sure about your channels, or you haven't done any channel setting up whatsoever, you can select all channels, and the MIDI track can look for MIDI signals coming in from all 16 channels coming from that specific port. Or if you want to go even more basic than that, you can select all, and this track will be looking at signals, or looking for signals coming from all 3 of my MIDI ports, from B and A on the MIDI Sport, and from the MIDI input coming from the IR, my PreSonus interface.
Yeah, that's an important point, and I think that this is something that it really comes down to what you're doing, right? So I have no friends, so I'm always by myself for obvious reasons, clearly. But if I'm working by myself, do I have to set a specific port and MIDI channel for my controller? No, I don't. I can just set it to all, and then whatever thing I'm playing, it will send that MIDI data onto that track, and kind of ignore all the MIDI channels, which basically Pro Tools tends to ignore MIDI channel input anyways because of the way that Pro Tools treats MIDI. It does recognize MIDI channels on output, but on input it's kind of agnostic, right? Now, the other way you could work it, let's say that Dave and Anders came over to my house and I've got different controllers and everybody's playing a different instrument together onto 3 different tracks. Well, at that point, that's when Dave wants to go, okay, so, Andy's instrument is attached to this keyboard, attached to this port, and then maybe even on this channel, right? And then Anders is a different one. And at that point, the individual tracks will only be recognizing and will only be hearing the data that corresponds to that port and or MIDI channel. So a lot of folks that work by themselves in project studios just leave their MIDI inputs on all the time.
And there's one more use of leaving it at all as well, because I have a digital piano over here, and that one doesn't have any controllers, doesn't have a pitch bend, doesn't have an expression. So I'll use a second keyboard and just use the expression on that keyboard while playing on the digital piano. So I tend to leave them at all the time.
Yeah, so the note data will be coming in from one keyboard on one channel, and the expression data and all the controller data will be coming in to the same track, but from a different channel. Right. And that one track is capturing everything all at the same time.
Because it's listening to all.
Because it's listening to all. And then on the output, that output you set, a specific destination and channel, right? And at that point, it takes all the data wherever it's come from. Yeah. All the data that's on that track just gets spit out that one single channel of output.
Yeah, exactly. And we can route that data to a specific instrument, and Pro Tools will see the MIDI output port will see every instrument that you have available on actually in the session, and you can select where you specifically want to route those to, or you can route it back out to the keyboard to have the keyboard play the sounds and then record those back in through a physical input. So it's incredibly versatile. Now, this is the traditional way that we've done it in the versions of Pro Tools before the instrument track came along. Before I think it was version 7. Andy, you might remember more than me. I think it was version 7 where the instrument track appeared.
Either 7 or 7.4.
7.4.
It was one of the
7.4. I think, yeah. So, but I think for a majority of us, this is going to be how we're going to be recording a majority of our MIDI data on the instrument track. And I've just, you wouldn't necessarily know it because the instrument track and this auxiliary track here, they look very similar. So I've just left the colors so that we can differentiate from the different track types. But back in the old days, we used to use MIDI tracks and the auxiliary tracks together to be able to run a MIDI instrument. The instrument track fixed that by amalgamating the two tracks into one track type. So it records and plays back MIDI data, but it has an audio path built in. Now, just in our standard view here, we can see a slight issue in that we don't seem to be able to see the audio inputs the MIDI inputs and the MIDI outputs as we do in the MIDI track. We can only see our audio inputs and our audio outputs, which can present a problem if you're trying to set up MIDI data going into your instrument track. So if we go up here and we show the instrument section, we can suddenly see our data, our input and our output. We hit record there. You can see that the little MIDI meter right there, the MIDI data meter right there, is showing data going in, and it's funneling that data to the expand instrument on the auxiliary track. Now, if we stick another instrument on here, let's just stick DB33 on here. Notice something, that Pro Tools didn't automatically update that there's an instrument actually on our instrument track. We need to manually change that. Normally what will happen, if there hasn't been an assignment made already, Pro Tools will automatically see that you want to route the MIDI data to that specific instrument, and it will do it for you. But there may be some cases where you might need to do some manual routing, and that's just generally how we do it. Now that DB33 is in there, it shows up in your MIDI output list. It can only accept a single MIDI channel at once, which is why it doesn't show us any MIDI channels here. It's a single node. It can only accept one MIDI channel at a time, whereas Expand can accept 4. DB33 can only accept 1. And when we hit stuff now, we can see that data is being routed to the MIDI instrument on the instrument track. So setting up MIDI, there's a number of steps to do it, but once you've done it, and it's all based around here really, to set things up immediately. And I was setting this up this morning. You don't even need to close Pro Tools for this stuff to recognize. Once it's in MIDI Studio, Pro Tools will see it. You wouldn't necessarily need to have to restart the DAW to make that happen. But as long as you understand how the MIDI inputs and the MIDI outputs work on the MIDI tracks and on the instrument tracks, being able to get signals into your tracks and then send those MIDI that MIDI data off to either a auxiliary track or to the instrument on the instrument track, it should be relatively simple.
Yeah, I just had a look. Instrument tracks were introduced in 7.0. So since
7.0.
Yeah,
it was 7.0. Okay.
Yeah. So let me pick up a little bit on what Dave has already been talking about in the audio MIDI setup, the AMS, if it were, because there's a couple things that can sometimes trip you up if you don't know kind of what you're doing in there. So I'm going to share my screen real quick here.
I realize I didn't share my screen again. Sorry.
But we were looking at you instead.
Yeah, God help us all. No. You're great.
Sorry, I'll put on the cat filter. It'll be fine.
Now, you guys are seeing my Pro Tools screen, right?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. So basically, what Dave showed you is a best case scenario. Now, a good 50. Remember, the name of this program is audio MIDI setup. At a good 50% of the time, it will look like this. It's going to show you the audio devices, right? Because it's setting up both things. And if you're only seeing, for example, if you're only seeing this audio devices thing, you're not in the wrong place. You're just one click away seeing what you want to see. And what you have to do is you go to Window, and then you show or hide the windows that you want to see. So if you're only seeing your audio devices, then you want to show basically your MIDI. So, and I just clicked right out of there.
Yeah, that app's a real pain. It remembers show hide states.
It does, and
it?
it's a little bit it can be a little bit frustrating, especially if you haven't done it before. Now, what I've got a quartet, and the quartet has MIDI ins and outs, and I will use these MIDI ins and outs on my quartet to connect myself to an external instrument, except for I don't have an external instrument that uses a MIDI cable. What I've got are a number of different controllers that use USB. And so, for example, I've got this cool little thing called a Sensel Morph, which is really a great keyboard. If you want to get into multi polyphony expression keyboards, this is a great one to do. And what this will do, if you take a look, and if I click here, and I open up the, come on. There we go. If I double click here, and it opens up the, the details window, you see I've got my name, but I don't have any MIDI channels. Why? Because it doesn't apply to a controller that's connected by USB. It's just, it's sending in MIDI channel, whatever MIDI channel you want. And it really doesn't matter for Pro Tools because, like I said, the input is channel agnostic. Now, here's the thing, is if you're not sure that your controller is sending out data, then you can click what I had clicked already, is this little keyboard, which is called Test MIDI Setup, and it's worth its weight in gold. There are actually two things that are worth their weight in gold. Seeing the device that you need to see, this little circular button, Rescan MIDI, will basically take a look at all the devices that are attached, and if there's a device that it's not recognizing, it would pop up, right? So if you're not seeing the keyboard that you think you have attached, click this Rescan MIDI, and it'll probably pop up. If you're not sure if the device that's attached is actually spitting out MIDI data, then click this this test MIDI, okay, and then just hit, and you'll see that the up arrow, which is basically the MIDI coming in, is turning blue, and you hear like a little dink sound, right? Ding, 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 ding. At that point, everything's fine. Now, there's one little asterisk to all of this, is that you have to hit a key in order for this to work. If you turn a knob or pitch bend or anything like that, the only thing that this will hear, the only thing that this test MIDI hears is note data. So any other kind of data like sliders and stuff like that doesn't work.
That's great stuff.
This is the beginning of diagnosing signal flow, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what all of this is, yeah.
Can I add something to the MIDI Studio setup? So if I'm sharing my screen here, see my Pro Tools session, and I have a old school synthesizer just like Dave here. It's a Roland XP30, and I'm sure Dave will insert a picture of it in the film here. But what I've done is I had a JV30 for a long time. Great synth. So I went to set up MIDI Studio, and that's the way you can open MIDI Studio from within Pro Tools, by the way. And just like Andy just warned me, it opened the audio devices list here. So I'll just click on Window, Show MIDI Studio to show the MIDI Studio instead. And you can see me here having the XP30 as a synthesizer. And if I double click it, you can see all of the settings here, all of the channels that it transmits, and all of the channels it will receive, because it's a multi-trimble synth. But the important part is this: if I set the manufacturer to Roland and the model from the model list as the XP30, Pro Tools will do a very cool little trick here. So I'll just close MIDI Studio. There's no need to have that open. But in my instrument track now, so if I go into the mixer and I look at the instruments section here, you can see the instrument is set to the input of all, meaning I can play any keyboard, and the XP30 is on this side, and that works. And the other keyboard that I have also works to play on. But the important part here is setting the MIDI output to the XP30 channel 1. And what now happens is, down below the fader, right here, there are two small windows, and they're called the patch select. And if I click that, I actually get all of the patch names from the XP30 with all of the user banks and preset banks and cards that I have installed. It will just automatically grab those and show it. So if I switch to Vibra Rhodes here and hit done, it will play the Vibra Rhodes sound.
That's insanely cool.
Yeah, and you don't have to be in the mix window, by the way, to do this. This also works directly from the edit window, and there you have the same little button there where you can go in and select a patch.
There's a couple of caveats to this, though.
Yeah.
One is that if you don't choose the MIDI manufacturer, so for example, let's say for whatever reason that in that list in audio MIDI setup, your manufacturer and the brand of controller isn't listed. Are you screwed? No, you're not. It's just that same button will just give you patch numbers.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not absolutely hosed if you don't see the manufacturer in there. The other thing is when Anders says it's pulling the patch data, it's pulling that patch data from a file on your computer. So
not specifically from the keyboard itself.
Yeah.
Not from the keyboard. And what that means, because this is a geek show, is that if you went in there and renamed or redid your patches on the keyboard, you customized it for yourself, that will not be reflected in this list because MIDI is not that kind of plug and play, not yet, right? And so that it's pulling the factory defaults.
It is, but you could also go in and actually create a midnam file, but that's a whole nother show, I guess.
That's a whole other show.
One very creative way to use this list, and you can do this for all of your plugins as well, like trying out EQ curves and stuff like that, is to select one of the patches and then set the time for increment patch every to, like, let's say 3 seconds here. And if I do that and click the increment patch every 3 seconds, Pro Tools will just advance or increment to the next patch every 3 seconds. So I can sit around and play and try out different sounds if I'm looking for something, or if I just need inspiration for something. That's a tool that you can use. And Andy, I think you have a workflow for this, right?
I have a hack on this because I'm a big dumb animal. So first of all, I use this for all sorts of things. Every Pro Tools plugins librarian window, which is what this is, every single window has this increment. And you can use this on compressors, you can use this on EQs, you can use this on anything, right? I started using this with exactly what Anders is showing, is to kind of preview different sounds. But I'm a big believer in closing my eyes and listening instead of looking at the settings, right?
Yeah.
So I've actually put a compressor on a track and let it loop and let it cycle through the presets so that I can kind of hear when I'm in the ballpark, so that I know to stop. Here's the problem. When you close your eyes, you have no idea what name is going by. And by the time you've opened up your eyes, it's very possible that it's kept on going. Yeah. So here's what you do, is you keep your mouse parked right over that little checkbox, and you keep your finger on the mouse.
Yeah.
Then you can close your eyes. And then as soon as you hear something that you like, click so it stops cycling. Because you feel like the biggest idiot, because it's like, wow, that sounded perfect. It was 4 seconds ago. Okay, so that would be that one.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it. Okay, so that's how you can display your patch names if you're using an old school MIDI instrument like we are.
Are these downloadable anywhere? Is there a library of these that you can go and source?
They actually come with your Pro Tools installation. It's a Pro Tools feature that Pro Tools provided.
So Avid have made them up and.
Yeah. And we update it occasionally. I think it's safe to say that there's a lot. It is fairly historical, and it really only applies. By the way, it only applies to external sound generating gear, which is starting to be. I'm not going to say it's unpopular, but studios are using MIDI controllers a lot more and software instruments a lot more, and using an external device to make sound. Is great, but it's not a growing demographic. And what Anders was mentioning is specifically for an external piece of gear. If you're using an internal piece of gear, well then, that's part of the plugin, right?
Yeah,
so there's nothing you need to do. So if you open up Expand, it pulls that data from the plugin, and in that case, when you do make changes and tweaks, that's saved, right? That is a better way to tweak if you're working as a tweaker like that. But of course, obviously, that would be limited only to a virtual instrument.
Great. So Andy, you explained the USB setup of a USB keyboard, which is more or less plug and play. Usually just works. You insert the keyboard and then it will most of the time just work, right?
Did I not just do that?
Yeah.
I thought I did.
Yeah. Cut this out, Dave.
like, wait, did I just have a brain embolism?
No, we're doing great. I'm thinking I'm going to have to do no editing on the show whatsoever.
Yeah, except for right now.
We're nailing it. So Titan's original question was, I'm using Pro Tools. When I go to set up MIDI input devices, his keyboard is checked and enabled, but there's no signal coming out.
Oh, yeah, so there's a couple of... do you want me to take this, Dave, or do you
please.
want to...
Well,
please.
One thing that you have to make sure in Pro Tools is that in the options menu, there is a function called MIDI through, which is basically the function that passes MIDI data between different tracks, like a virtual patch. If you have an external synthesizer or a USB keyboard that's connected to Pro Tools, it's Pro Tools creating virtual MIDI nodes within Pro Tools to forward that signal. And that's done using the MIDI through option here. So if you untick this, nothing will work. Basically, you cannot play anything on your keyboard. This will still sound, but it's not passing any MIDI data. And the other keyboard does absolutely nothing, even though my track is in record enable and it's set, the instrument is set to receive on all channels. And as you can see here, the XP30 will actually play audio, but there is no MIDI signal coming in, as we see up here. Mm-hmm. So if you really want to annoy someone that you don't really like, you go into his Pro Tools and set the option MIDI through to off, and he will probably pull his hair out for a couple of hours before he finds this.
And then end up on the Pro Tools users forum.
Exactly.
Screaming, Pro Tools is rubbish!
And but there's a similar function that is called the MIDI, the default MIDI through option, which Andy will tell you about right now.
Yeah. So let me real quickly kind of back up. Hold on a second.
While Andy's doing that, is there any way to turn that off by accident?
No, there's not that I know.
No shortcut for it.
There's
no
you
shortcut.
specifically have to go and turn it off manually, so it couldn't happen by accident.
Now I want to put. I feel like this whole show has been me putting asterisks on everything that Andrew says. He's right, but there's one thing I kind of wanted to add to that is if you're actively recording, not record on, but actually recording, you don't have to have MIDI through on. So if you're in the act of recording, so playback is happening, you're actually recording, having MIDI through on or off doesn't matter. It'll still work, right? What is happening here is if MIDI through is off and you record on but not recording, that's when you have that problem. It can cause all sorts of confusion. Yeah. Now, this kind of harkens back to the old days of MIDI, where you had your keyboards and there would be a MIDI import, which takes MIDI data coming into the synthesizer, a MIDI output, which then is sending MIDI data out of the keyboard into whatever sequencer, like Pro Tools, and then there's a MIDI through port. And what the MIDI through port would do is it would take all the data that's going in the MIDI import and then just pass it so that all the devices on in the daisy chain of MIDI devices, it'll then pass that data on. Now, MIDI through has come to take a little bit of a different meaning inside of Pro Tools, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to go into my setup menu and go into preferences. And in preferences, I'm going to go from here to the MIDI tab. Now, right here in the basics section, you're going to see the default through instrument. And in my session right now, I've got a number of different virtual instruments. And if I click this, you can see here that I've got all the different virtual instruments on all the individual tracks in my session. And this will change if you have more or fewer virtual instruments in your session. So this is session dependent. And this is going to choose a couple things. And just for fun, I'm going to choose the Mini Grand. Okay, so I'm going to click this. And I'm going to click OK, boom. And now what's going to happen is if I play, and if MIDI through is enabled from the options menu, then you can see I just played something on my keyboard, and the piano on the Chords piano track, the first track on my session, that's the one that played. That's one function of the default MIDI through instrument. Here's the second one, is I can preview a MIDI clip from the clips list by holding down the Option key. And I'm going to click this, and it's going to preview that clip on the track as determined by the MIDI through instrument. Now, let's take it one step further. And this is a way that I like to work. So I'm going to go back into my preferences, and instead of choosing any specific instrument, I'm going to choose instead follows first selected MIDI track. And what this is going to allow me to do is work in a different way. Let's say I wanted to listen to Falcon. I'm going to select this. This is the Falcon track down here, is the first selected MIDI track or instrument track. And now if I play, let's go with the expand. Great, so I can play around with that sound. I'm going to change this. Great. So the first selected MIDI track then can be what you will hear when MIDI through is enabled, okay? And no other track is record armed. And my last favorite one, this is for Pro Tools Answers. Check it out.
Pro Tools Answers. Problem solved.
Go a little bit of branding for you right there. Now, it goes one step further. Again, I've got these chords, right? And that is this clip, instrument 101. If I want to hear it on Loom, then I could go ahead and hold down the Option key.
Pro Tools Answers. Problem solved.
Okay. If I want to hear on Falcon, hold down the Option key, click on the clip, and it plays the first selected MIDI track, because that's what I've set in my preferences. Now, the logic holds through. If I have Falcon and both of the expands selected, you won't hear all three. The preference does what it says it's going to do. You'll be hearing it out of the first, the top selected track. So I'm going to hold down Option again. I'm going to click instrument 1, and you're going to hear it from the first selected MIDI track. And again, you can choose from the preferences, you can choose a specific instrument, or you can choose something like follows first selected MIDI track, which is the way that I work. So there you go.
That's great stuff, Andy.
Cool.
That's awesome.
The MIDI default through instrument is great for just jamming along. You don't have to record enable a track, like Andy said. It's a great feature.
Exactly right.
And by the way, I saw a post on the user forum a couple of days ago. Why can't Pro Tools preview my clips in the clip list in MIDI? And this is the way how to do it. You have to assign an instrument first.
We're called Pro Tools Answers, baby.
Yeah.
Pro Tools Answers.
And we don't even need to add that to the features episode.
It's already in there. You basically have to tell Pro Tools what instrument to use.
Yeah.
And this is also a preference that's session based. It's not saved forever, because in the next session you create, you might not even have that instrument. So you have to set this up per session.
Right. And by the way, that's a great point. And what I do, and again, this is just my own workflow, but I've got a bunch of session templates that are for different styles of music with the instruments already loaded in, so that. And by the way, when you open up a session or a session template, those preferences travel with the session. So, you just have that preference, first selected MIDI track, boom, and then you can start to work in that very flexible way.
Yeah, great.
So in terms of the original question, is there anything that we might have missed that would prevent Titan's MIDI data getting from his keyboard to his Pro Tools?
Yeah, sure. So there could be stuff with the MIDI input filter, right, Andy?
Yes.
Yeah. I actually have a workflow around that, but just to kind of go back to the original question, it's all about signal flow. His question there is nothing that's not signal flow. So if you make sure that it's set up in audio MIDI setup, that's step 1. If you take care of the default through instrument, that's step 2. If you take care of the inputs and outputs, which Dave showed you, that's step 3. But even if everything is perfectly set up, you could have data coming in, but Pro Tools might be actively filtering it out.
Yeah.
And this is something, it might sound like something that nobody would want, but I just want to show you a workflow that I use all the time that uses the ability to filter out, which might be exactly what's causing Titus the problem that he's having. But if you understand how it works, you can actually do some pretty cool things with it. All right, so here I've got a session, and you can see I've got some audio and some video along with it. Let me just start off by playing it so you can see what we're starting with. All right, so for anybody who recognizes that melody, that's from the middle of the Jupiter Movement of Whole Planet Suite, which melody's been used for a lot of other different things. And I specifically did this on a fretless instrument that has a bad neck, and I did it one time. So I didn't want to perfect it, didn't want to do anything. I just wanted to get a good emotional, hopefully, performance. Now, the first thing I'm going to do in this workflow that shows this feature I'm going to get to eventually is this new feature that we've got in Pro Tools that converts audio to MIDI. And the way I do it, super easy, is I'm going to drag this audio clip down onto a MIDI track, and it's going to give me the audio MIDI properties, and there are a number of different ways that I can go, but I'm just going to go with automatic just to make things really simple and just to show you how good this is out of the box. So here I go, click OK. Great. Now, let's listen to both of them together because I want to show you how good this tracks. So it's really not too bad. There are a couple little oops notes in there, which is not unusual with a neck that buzzes and with a neck that's fretless, so the pitch is going to be off a little bit, but it really does about 90% of your transcription work for you right there. Now, what I'll do, just because I want to make it a little bit more smooth for this demonstration, is I have cleaned it up, so I've got on a different playlist. This is the cleaned up version. I haven't changed the timings, I just deleted a couple of errant notes. Now, I want to change this into a cello part. And so what I've got here is I've got a cello, and I'm just going to go ahead and drag this down to this track over here. All right. Now I'll make these other tracks. I'll just mute these guys, and I'll solo this. And this just happens to be using the East-West library, which I use a lot for my string work. So let's see what it sounds like just out of the box. Okay, well that sounds pretty good, and actually the patch has some nice vibrato in it already. But what I want to do is I want to add a little bit of a continuous controller number 11, which is called expression. And I want to use a different kind of controller for it. So I'm going to use this thing. I'll show it to you right here. It's called a Theramini by Moog. And it's a fun little controller. If you have enough money to pick one up, it's really fun to play with. And it's also can be very expressive. You control it with gestures from your hands. Really great for what I'm about to do. And so what I want to do is I want to use this controller to add MIDI Continuous Controller 11 and only that. Right? This controller can create note data, pitch bend, a whole bunch of things. But the only thing I want to record is going to be that controller number 11. Here's how I filter out everything else. I'm going to go to Setup, MIDI, MIDI Input Filter. And what we see here could possibly be the problem that the person asking the question is having. Because it's possible that this has been set to only and nothing set. And if that's happening, then even though MIDI is connected correctly, nothing would actually be recorded. Okay, so this will allow you to not accept MIDI data for certain parameters, right? And so this could be the problem this person's having. But even if it's not, it's a great feature to be able to use and to understand. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to only allow a certain controller in, and I'm going to go to one of my controllers, doesn't matter which one, and I'll go in here and I can see from the list I don't have MIDI continuous controller number 11, so I'm going to add it. Boom. I'll go over here, expression, add, okay. Now if I go to any of these drop downs, I can choose expression number 11. I check this box. Now, the way you're looking at the screen right now, my controller could be sending out all kinds of data, but the only data that's going to be recorded is going to be expression, which is at MIDI controller 11. I click OK. The second thing I want to make sure I do is I want to make sure that MIDI merge, which is up here in my MIDI cluster, is on. And what that's going to allow me to do is keep the MIDI data that's here, and it's going to add other MIDI data on top of it. And in this case, it's only going to add that MIDI continuous controller number 11. Now, what I'll do is I'll do a live pass with my Theremin, and let's see if I can't put a little bit of nuance into this performance. And now what I've done is I've added that on top. And if I play it back, you're going to be able to see that I've got a little bit of continuous controller 11, adding a little bit of very subtle dynamics onto this performance.
That's fantastic, Andy.
It's insanely cool. So MIDI filters are effectively acting like a digital Gandalf. You know, none shall pass.
Well, I've got the beard for it. Well, it's coming in. It's coming in.
Great.
Yeah, it like so many things with Pro Tools, and part of the reason why Pro Tools Answers even exists is because for every great feature there is, a great workflow around it, there's a way to misunderstand it, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, if you're not careful and you just go in and click things, you know, trying to get stuff to happen or not, it's possible that you could filter out all the data and you could have everything connected, everything's working, everything's properly set up, except for that one thing, except for that input filter is wrong, which obviously begs the question, why does it even exist? And hopefully that's one workflow that hopefully I was able to show it.
And to pick up the point on misunderstanding, that the audio to MIDI conversion was incredibly accurate, right? In that, and as you said, just out of the box, you know, we saw it go drag from one to the other and just give you those notes. No editing on that performance. As you said, there's always.
I'll tell you what. In the interest of absolutely full disclosure, so that other playlist that I showed you, the only things that I did was I shortened a couple of instruments to give a little bit of a detached bow. Mm-hmm. That's it. I didn't change the timing. The start time of every note was exactly the same as it was before. And there was one note where I think it heard a buzz on my very terrible guitar neck, and it thought it was a note, which it wasn't. So. But it was minimal. It took me 2 minutes to clean it up, and there you go. And it's
that's fantastic.
It's a very useful feature.
My point is that people should kind of temper their expectations that when you're using stuff like that, where Pro Tools is essentially making the decisions for you, it's never going to be 100% perfect, is there? There's always going to be a little bit of cleanup, a little bit of editing. Yeah. And it's the same thing with Elastic Audio and Quantize and things like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, let your ears be the guide. But I mean, it's but what it does for you, the time it saves, it's
phenomenal.
Amazing.
Yeah, but one thing, just to get back to this thing that Andy just said, is if you accidentally click somewhere, and not all features in Pro Tools are like the default through instrument that are just session sorry, I'm searching for the word here. You guys help.
Session specific.
Session specific, but they stay forever. So even closing Pro Tools and opening Pro Tools again will still have the same. The MIDI through option, for instance, is just one of those things that will remain, even though you close Pro Tools, and people get frustrated by those things. But of course, they're there, and so that once you make one setting, it should remain, so you don't have to do it all over and over and over and over again.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So I think we've covered as much as we possibly can do with MIDI inputs. Would that be accurate?
I think we've beaten this horse to death. But it's a great question, and it's a question a lot of folks have. Titus came up with a great question, and thank you for asking it, by the way, Titus.
Yeah. One more thing. Always check your cables as well, because I've had that once where I connected a USB controller and it turned out the USB cable was just not working. So that's maybe one thing to check as well.
Yeah,
that's
some
where
just
that
don't
MIDI
carry
comes
the
in.
data. Yeah, and the testing. So some cables just don't carry the data that you expect them to. It's odd sometimes. There's no rhyme or reason to it sometimes.
And that's because some cables are strictly for USB charging, right? So they don't have a data pass through. So that's why I mentioned this. Check your cable.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, because this is kind of a show where we're a bunch of old farts talking about how we feel about different things. It's
that's its USP.
So let me ask you guys a question. So one of the things, so this is the Sensel. This is that USB controller that I've got, and it's really cool. By the way, if we could do another show on just the Sensel, and I love this controller. It is USB, but it also can operate as a wireless Bluetooth MIDI. And you can even see that in the audio MIDI setup, there's a Bluetooth button. I've set this up as Bluetooth and been singularly unimpressed by the amount of latency that happens. Have you guys ever
where you were
played?
going to go.
Is it just me, or have you guys found that Bluetooth MIDI over Bluetooth is almost unusably latent?
I've not even tried it. I'm sorry.
No, I've not used it as well, but just the concept makes me very nervous. We've used USB for a long time.
I knew you were going to say that, Dave, the only guy that only uses MIDI cables, no USB.
Right.
Well, it actually you're kind of right, because I use keyboards live, and I'm using MainStage live, and I don't want to use the USB solution. I want the flexibility of actual MIDI, and I want those signals passing through the old school cables, the old school cable way. And I some things I just don't think need to change.
But I would like to toss this to our viewers. So let us know what you think. What were your experiences with the Bluetooth keyboards? I'd really like to know, because I don't have any.
Yeah. I mean, the dropouts that I get with Bluetooth devices, it just makes me think, if I'm going to give that killer performance, why would I want it to be killed by just a single Bluetooth dropout? And I know you could probably get the same things with a CPU spike or anything like that, but Bluetooth, where you don't really need it.
I have the advantage of being a terrible keyboard player and never having given a killer performance, so it doesn't matter if it drops out. But the latency is just it saps my will to live. I'll be honest with you, and it might just be me, and I'm really interested. So if you've got a comment, if you had a Bluetooth keyboard that works really well, or not, put it in the comments. Let's have a discussion.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I think as Andy said, we've beaten that subject to death. Hopefully that's going to help a number of you guys be able to configure and diagnose your MIDI problems. But really enjoyable discussion today. Thank you very much to Andy and Anders.
Thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
And thank you to you guys for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have your company, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. If you've enjoyed what we're doing, please hit subscribe. Please hit the bell icon so you get the notifications of the videos when they pop up. We put them out on every Sunday morning, so please be there with a coffee and a brew when you wake up to enjoy an episode of Pro Tools Answers with us. And all leaves me to say is thank you to the guys for joining me. Thank you to you guys. My name's Dave. This is Pro Tools Answers, and we're out.